All right, well, let's jump into the news because, it was all quiet on the Western Front. And then all of a sudden, Shams had his own Woj bomb. And
What are we gonna call the Shams bombs?
the Shams shebangs.
The sh- oh God, that sounds terrible.
But yeah, he dropped the news for a trade. No one was expecting it. I messaged Grace like,
I was not expecting it. I was watching a Korean cooking competition show, and actually, no. David and I were watching Rings of Power, and
oh,
then
nice.
I got the text from you, cat to New York, cat to New York, and I'm like, what? And
Yeah.
then David was like, okay, we could just watch tomorrow. It's fine.
We got the Shams tweet, which I tweeted out my initial reactions, just being shocked, and then immediately thinking about the Nuggets in this Twin Tower lineup, the thing that we had been worried about all last season that actually kind of ended up eliminating us from the playoffs, among many other things, but that was a big reason. So I think Nuggets fans were pretty positive, and even Nuggets media were tweeting about how they thought this, well, at least some, not all, that this could potentially make the matchup easier for us. So it was all really exciting from a Nugget standpoint. Where did you first end up thinking about the trade? Like, what was your
So,
process?
well, I had to say just my first thoughts on the deal. I was like, what are the details on this, right? Carl Anthony Towns goes to the New York Knicks, and the Knicks trade Julius Randle and Dante DiVincenzo to the Minnesota Timberwolves, and New York also has to move some smaller contracts to make the money match up. So Minnesota's not taking on more money, but New York has to send out more money. They had to get Charlotte involved as a third team, and that deal actually isn't finalized yet. So we're, like you said, recording on Tuesday, October 1st. I think every other team had their media day yesterday, and Kat and Randall were not able to speak at their respective media days because that deal is not finalized yet, and so the team is not really allowed to acknowledge that it's in the works because they're still working out this third um, thing. I mean, my first reaction was, "Wow, is this good for the Nuggets?"
Yeah,
Really, I joined in the jubilee there. I do feel kind of bad for Kat because he really bought into his role on the Timberwolves last season as this is Ant's team now and all of this, right? It's so clear that Minnesota made this move to get off of Cat's contract that there's no way around that. I don't think that this Randall um, move improves the team, but they're doing the thing that a lot of people said that teams, in their sort of pay bracket are going to have to do, which is turn big contracts into smaller ones to gain flexibility. I think they're still technically a second apron team this year, but they'll have the ability to get out of it next year. Um, I don't think that they're going to extend Julius Randle. There are still questions about if he's even going to be able to play from the beginning of the season. That was one of the things that we heard rumblings of coming out of New York last week, kind of paired with the news of Mitchell Robinson's injury that was going to keep him out. Don't really know what the state of Randall's health is now, but he's in a contract year. Now he's going to be with a new team. Probably going to be starting whenever he is, healthy enough to do so, because if not, if I were him and his agent, I would be making incredibly loud rumblings to just trade him because he is in a contract year and not being able to start, play big minutes and show off what you can do, even if it's not for the Timberwolves, for other teams that might sign you next offseason. So I think that it's just it injected a lot more chaos into the chemistry for a Minnesota Timberwolves team that seemed to be really together um, last season, and trading away Kat, who was their longest tenured player on that team. Now, it's a new era over there.
yeah, and there was questions about even the Knicks chemistry injecting Cat into that, and there's a good question on the Wolves side with Randall and what Tim Connolly sees his role being. And I think initially a lot of people just went to the side of pointing out that that fit might be awkward or not the best fit since Cat was a floor spacer And Anthony Edwards is one of the best, if not the single best, rim pressuring players in terms of how
Not the
he,
single best, but he's up there.
yeah.
Let's calm down.
So he needs that space. He's going to benefit him to have more space. And Cat was their second option on offense. So without that, and Julius Randle kind of being more of a, ball heavy dribbler, ISO own shot creator, is that going to fit, or is that going to take some pressure off of Ant? Like, how are they going to make it work? Randall did play with some players on the Knicks who weren't, the ideal spacing types of players, and still put up some stats. So
I
it's
mean, some, yeah, in terms of like the front court, right? They
yeah,
don't have any shooting fives there. He
yeah,
definitely likes to play bully ball a lot. But, people were talking about how crowded the paint was when it was Cat and Rudy, even though Cat's like spacing out to the line, like in terms of from Ant's perspective. Now, when it's Randall out there, no one's respecting that 3-point shot necessarily. Although I was listening to some analysis on this, and particularly from, I believe it was someone from Nick's Film School. A great Twitter account, by the way. Like, they're
yeah. I love
awesome
them.
at breaking down film about the Knicks. Teams do like to load up a lot on Julius Randle because they play him for his drives. Like, being able to shoot is not the only way to space the floor, right? And when you are a threat to really drive, if the defender's even slightly out of position, they can't fully ignore you, especially someone as big and strong as Julius Randle is. So I'm not saying that it's like this deal is like a total negative or anything like that, especially because they got Dante DiVincenzo, who's just going to be able to help any team that he's on, right? With the skill set that he has as a volume shooter. But just in terms of the Randle fit, my initial inclination is that it's going to be awkward, especially as they try to figure out those rotations. It's different when it's Cat and he's got his max deal like locked in, super max deal locked in, and he's like, okay, if I don't close games sometimes, that's whatever. Julius Randle, again, he's in a contract year. Are you going to be closing games with Nas over him on a frequent basis? And is that going to cause issues for Julius or not? And then on the New York side, I just think it's a good move for New York. It's a lot of money to take on with Cat's contract, of course. And I don't necessarily think that he is, worth that money, quote unquote, especially that percentage of the cap. But they've got Brunson taking a discount on his deal. They don't know like what kind of deal Mikal Bridges is going to be asking for on his next extension. So maybe they'll be able to stay under the second apron, even with all of these guys on the money that they're on. And they needed a 5. They just needed a 5. They didn't have a playable one. It was going to have to be either Julius or OG, and we don't even know what state of health Julius is in for the beginning of the season, at the 5 to start the season, or you're starting Jericho Sims, who is not an NBA starting caliber player. It was a position of need. They added a really good player at that position. I don't know what it's going to look like defensively on the interior, but they've got the wings to try to mitigate whatever defensive shortcomings Cat has as a sole 5. But he's no slouch on that end either. And you give again Jalen another shot creator who it had in Randall, but obviously the injury concern is a thing. So I'm saying I don't think they lost too much offensively, and they really addressed a position of need.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It sucks that they had to get rid of DiVincenzo, but Minnie, it seems like from all the reporting on this that Minnie was holding out for that. It sounds like New York was trying to offer Julius and Mitchell Robinson for Cat earlier in the summer. So all those questions we had of like, man, I wish the Wolves would move Cat out of my conference. They were trying to, but New York wasn't willing to give up DiVincenzo until apparently the rumors are that he wasn't as into the Nova Knicks, like whatever.
Yeah,
thing as everybody else was, which,
Well, I have
whatever.
seen conflicting. I've seen people say that that was not true, also. So
Okay.
I don't know what to believe with that. But yeah, I
I
think
think New York just got more desperate.
yeah. Well, that's kind of the thing. People are asking about the timing of this trade. What's the deal with that? I think it's partly the Knicks' desperation to replace that position, and they had questioned like they knew coming into the season that Randall was a big question, so they decided, you know what, we're going to be done with that. Cat's on the table. Let's do that. And you can talk about the contract. That's going to be an interesting question down the line for New York. Everyone's kind of trying to parse out the motivations from the Timberwolves side. How much of this was a financial thing versus a purely basketball fit thing? We can debate that back and forth too. Don't really know what Tim Connolly's thinking. I do remember though, the Nuggets fans were, always talking about Minnesota and if they were designed specifically to beat the Nuggets. And the Rudy Gobert trade was a big part of that design and like the two big lineups.
Oh, so
Um,
you've conceded that point now.
I don't know. I have my own beliefs about it, but when that trade happened, I thought Cat was definitely going to be traded. I was like, okay, they got Rudy Gobert. Now Cat probably is going to be moved to like, fill in this roster and like get more deep or get more rotation pieces. And I didn't think it was going to happen a year after that trade. I thought it was going to be much sooner. So that's kind of why, in the back of my mind, I wasn't buying the whole like they're designed to beat the Nuggets because I always thought if he doesn't work out, they can just trade him. And if he did, if he does work out, then it's like cool, it worked out, nice. So I just thought Tim Connolly was just waiting to see, and
Right.
it's
And
kind
it
of
worked
weird.
out. They
Yeah,
made the Western
yeah.
Conference Finals.
So it was like it didn't
And
happen
yeah,
how I thought it would work out because they went further than they ever had before, and then they ended up trading him after he played like arguably his best basketball. So I think the Knicks got a little better and the Wolves got a little worse, at least for next season. But this could work out well in terms of down the road for the Wolves. And
yeah,
also, yeah, the Wolves might have like they got two more players, right? So that's more theoretical lineups that they can employ versus certain teams. So it's like they could do a
right.
little more, but I think versus the Nuggets, it's better for us. So it's like you make your trade-offs.
I had one comment on that too. Just like, you talked about your initial reaction and the kind of jubilee online about this move from the Nuggets fandom. I I think you're the one that posed this question about like who the Nuggets' biggest rivals were the Wolves a rival? And I was like, maybe. And the reaction to this trade kind of like made me feel like I was wrong for downplaying it
Mm,
because it's so clear, even from our fan base's perspective, that that was the team. Like, maybe not the team, but a team. That was a rival. That's a
hmm
team. I think, like Lakers fans think there's a rivalry between the Nuggets and the Lakers. Um, but those are completely different calibers of teams at this point. Um, but the Wolves were it. They're in our division, all of this stuff. So yeah, I wonder if rivalry week is going to be as interesting now. Probably still will be. The Wolves are still a really good team. Like they are still going to be right there in the hunt for a top seed. But this was definitely a blow for them in terms of just that Denver specific matchup.
All right, well, let's get an update on the WNBA because Grace was covering that with Lucas Kaplan and Steve Jones on our last episodes, which was great. If you haven't listened to that, go check that out again. What's going on with the WNBA, Grace?
So, like we talked about last week with Steve Jones, WNBA playoffs are well underway. We're in the middle of round 2 right now. We're actually recording before the game 2s of the semifinals go down. Game 1s were pretty crazy. The Liberty versus the Las Vegas Aces game 1 was incredibly tense. I felt like the Liberty controlled it for most of the time, though. I think Sabrina Ionescu and Brianna Stewart were both electric in that game offensively, and Brianna on defense was like literally everywhere. So like everything that we talked about in our playoff previews for that team um, and that we talked about in terms of the series previews kind of went down in game 1. One of the keys for the Liberty is going to continue to be to defend Asia Wilson as well as they did in game 1. She still scored, but they held her to less than 30 points, right? I think it was 19 points in game one, if I recall correctly. And yeah, the Liberty looked really good. Let's see if they can keep it up in game two tonight. Barclays Center was on fire. Like, it was funny because I was watching this game on TV, and then I had a power outage here in California, just like a random one. This is not related to hurricanes. We're okay. Everybody's okay. We're not in the path. And I had to go to a sports bar. It was crazy because like the Liberty had gone up 18 in the time that it took me to get there. So I'm like, oh, the game's over. As soon as I start watching, the Aces go on a 10-0 run to cut the game down. Because that team doesn't go away. Like you have to beat them.
Mm-hmm.
They're not going to beat themselves, especially not in like the heightened playoff environment. So that was really fun. And then the other series is the Minnesota Lynx, another Minnesota defensive team, as we've talked about, versus the Connecticut Sun. Those are the top two defenses in the WNBA. And that game was so strange to me because it was basically a shootout for 3 quarters. And then in the fourth quarter, both teams just locked down and there were just 5-minute stretches where nobody was scoring. It was wild. I didn't quite know how to fully comprehend that. It was an interesting strategy that the Sun were employing where, Nafisa Collier had gone off for, WNBA playoff records of 40 points per game in round one. And the Sun decided to play her in single coverage and see if she could just keep it up with, particularly she likes to go to a post fadeaway, and it just wasn't good enough offense to sustain what Minnesota needed, even though the Sun aren't like a high-powered offensive team either. I just think that Minnesota blew a lot of offensive opportunities when they got them, and the Sun, for most of the game, were like winning the possession battle. They were getting offensive rebounds, they were getting turnovers, forcing turnovers, that is. And then it wasn't until late in the game that Minnesota started getting some of those opportunities themselves, but they weren't able to capitalize on them. So not scoring on the other end after you were getting those extra possessions. And that was difficult. So, I thought the Lynx should be favored in this matchup. They were the, slightly higher seeded team, 2 versus 3. And, they were really impressive on both ends this past year. But I think that Connecticut's defense, when it does tighten up as it did late in that game, really presents them some unique problems because of that size mismatch. So I implore everyone in the audience to check out the WNBA playoffs because there's some really, really high level basketball happening and some really electrifying performances. Just even if it's only to hold you over until the NBA regular season starts up again, because it's been nice to get just like a hit of good basketball into my veins.
Yeah, the Aces and Liberty is such a cool matchup just based on hearing what you've talked about with Steve and Lucas. So, because everyone is kind of anticipating that matchup. So I like that excitement, and even Minnesota, like them being so almost like it seemed like they're like an underrated team almost, where it's like they're really good, but people might not, they're not like the household name like the Liberty or the Aces to like outside fans, but they're making a good case. So I'm excited to see who wins.
The cool thing about that series, the Lynx versus the Sun, is that they're both kind of like not talked about a ton.
Yeah.
Relative to, again, the Liberty and the Aces. So they're kind of like in like disrespect offs.
The true underdog. No one believes in us teams. Yes. Those are some fun, positive notes that happened around the basketball world. But there was a interesting little sad detail that occurred that I think will end up being a positive, but ESPN let go of Zach Lowe, who is a great writer and analyst and is on the Lowe Post podcast, if you've ever listened to that, and he's been on NBA Today and all over ESPN NBA related programming. I love Zach Lowe. He's one of my favorite people, so it was really sad to see ESPN move in this direction. Yeah, it's a big conversation that we may not dive into like a lot right now, but like you could do a whole show on ESPN and what they're doing with their NBA coverage and media talent and talking heads and the direction they're going. And I just think it's a direction that we don't necessarily like. We're kind of like the opposite of that on this show, or at least we try to be. So,
Oh, I was shocked, honestly, because it was literally the day after the episode drops where his interview with JJ Redick, new head coach of the
yeah.
Los Angeles Lakers, former, colleague of Zach Lowe over at ESPN. And I was just like, why? Like, what? That's crazy because, he snags this like high, um, like not high leverage, but like an important interview with like what I would think would be pretty popular, all of this stuff. I don't know what ESPN's direction is. I made this joke that the mouse
Mhm.
over at Disney, ESPN's parent company, must have given ESPN a hard cap and they have to fire all these people just so that they can pay Stephen A. Smith whatever it is that he wants. I don't really understand it. It's a continuation of cuts that they've been making for the last couple of years. Remember last summer, they made a lot of cuts to the on-air talent in particular. Zach Lowe, a different tier of that. It kind of makes me wonder whether Woj, do you think that he left because he thought he might have been part of a slate of cuts over at ESPN? Or did Woj leave because he didn't want to have to be the one to break the Zach Lowe news?
I don't know. It's hard to speculate, but I could see the decision to retire being almost influenced by the direction ESPN's going. And,
Mm,
I think Zach Lowe was pretty expensive because he does good work and he'd been there a long time and he'd been growing a platform. But, I could see that he may not hit the same type of appeal that ESPN might want, like the big flashy name that's in there that's like making headlines, and they put all his articles under the ESPN Plus umbrella, so you can't even read it unless you're subscribed to that. I bet you not a lot of people are subscribed to that or reading those articles because of
yeah.
that. So it's just like it's all awkward and weird, and it's
I'm
like it.
telling you, the people that are watching all the flashy guys are probably not reading ESPN Plus articles anyway.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like as much as I love Zach Lowe and I think every basketball fan should listen to him for fun, like I could see him not being like necessarily the number one draw for most fans, just because he's more niche in a way.
I don't think that's necessarily the case, honestly. Like I like to think of Zach Lowe as like the bridge between like the hardcore fan and like someone that
Yeah.
wants to just follow the ongoings of the league more casually because even, last I keep saying last year now, it's been over a year and a half since I like really dove into following the NBA as league. Zach Lowe was like incredibly digestible content for a casual viewer from my perspective.
Yeah, that's fair.
Um, and he could be really deep in his analysis without getting too far into the weeds. Like I actually I don't understand it. And if you're a network, like the point of a network is to have people that do different things. Like you're gonna have the Stephen A. Smiths and the Pat McAfees, but then having the Zach Lowe's and like the Tim Leglers also to cater to your
Hmm.
to like the breadth of your audience. This is just a continuation to me of ESPN not really understanding its NBA audience all that well. And in contrast to, everyone talks about how much better ESPN's NFL coverage is in terms of
Yeah.
like creating and maintaining a really high information uh, viewership in terms of like the fandom of the NFL, of various NFL teams. Like guys know how the game works
Hmm.
because that's the um how the media ecosystem treats them as people that understand how the game works and want to understand more about how the game works. Uh I don't know if you could comment on that at all
Yeah.
because I'm not like a big football
Right.
person, but that just seems to be like a consistent narrative.
I think it's true. I mean, there's more money in covering football for ESPN, I'm sure, with advertisers because it's so much more popular. I don't know like the exact
In
numbers
the
on that.
US, yeah.
Yeah. So
But globally, which I assume they're trying to expand, especially like Disney is trying to get everywhere, the NBA is trying to get everywhere, and basketball, I think of the two is probably it's either comparable
Hmm.
or more popular than football if you take it in the aggregate.
I do think football lends itself a little bit easier to more like analysis focused commentary because
I'm like,
every
what are we
play
doing here?
every play is stop. Like there's
Yeah.
a play and then there's a big break and then there's a play. And so it's like every single time you can talk about the scheme of that play. Whereas basketball, there's not enough time necessarily to really like go into every play. There's so many possessions. It's more free flowing. People have said basketball is just as much art as it is like scheme. There's random basketball, there's scheme basketball. NFL is like pretty much all scheme except for like sometimes a
Mm.
play breaks open and then you have some people improvising. But yeah, it's just harder to nail down how to cover basketball, I think, for most people. Like even JJ Redick talked about that. Like he was known as someone who could bring the scheme during his commentary, but even he talked about like how difficult it is to like fit that into the broadcast when it's so fast.
Mm. Right.
So the sport
Because of
just
the sheer
lends itself
volume
to
of
that.
possessions and
Which
I
is why it's
see, I can
fun to have
understand that.
shows like this where you do it like retrospectively. Like the game happened, then you
Yeah.
gotta go back and do a whole breakdown because there's not enough time during the game. But yeah,
Tim Legler does it
yeah,
with his touch screens.
there you go.
I'm just saying, you don't have to cover every single possession. Just,
Mm-mm.
even on this show, we're not covering every possession. We're talking about some representative samples.
Speaking of cable networks and media networks, Altitude has released their own streaming service, which was popular to discuss among Avs fans and Nuggets fans since that we'd been subjected to blackouts because Comcast is so prevalent in Colorado. So it left a lot of people hanging and unable to watch these games. There were other options that were out there, but it was always kind of like frustrating to use or it was expensive. I think Fubo was actually a pretty good option for Nuggets fans, but I don't know how popular that ended
Yeah,
up
you have
being
to
in
get
the
a
end.
streaming thing. I'm thinking like older people don't want to add another streaming thing, especially if they already have a cable package, right?
Mhm.
Fubo is like the cost of another cable package.
Yeah. Plus, like the internet that people are using in Colorado is Comcast. So it's like you're
Yeah.
probably getting the internet and then you want to get cable with it. It's just easier. So it's like, well, I want to watch the Denver sports and you can't. Anyway, now there's an option you can go directly to Altitude if you're in market and pay $20 a month and get the Avs games and the Nuggets games.
How do you feel about the price?
It's like pushing it a little bit to where I think some fans are questioning. It's not like a no-brainer, like, oh, yes, this is awesome. I'm getting this. Especially because it's not every game, because the national broadcast games I don't think are on it.
Right.
So it's
But the
like,
national broadcast games are theoretically people have access to the national broadcast games. It's the other games that were the problem. The other, portion of this is that there are going to be 20 games that are going to be on the local station 9 News and My 20. I don't live in Colorado, so I thankfully get to have everything on League Pass.
yeah,
But that should be,
that's
nice. It's
amazing.
20 games that are not on the national broadcast schedule, but they're going to be on the local channels. So, at least those
Yeah,
are there.
it's amazing. I'm so happy they did that. And I wish they did it in other seasons because that's a lot of games they're just giving for free. And it's cool. Hopefully that like gets people to buy Altitude Plus.
Right,
You know what I
right.
mean? Like,
We
so
got to give them a taste.
yeah, exactly. So hopefully more Nuggets accessibility and Avs accessibility for the Denver people. That's awesome. If you're watching, please subscribe. We're trying to get to at least 1,000 subs as quickly as possible. So please subscribe if you're listening. Hit the like button as well. That helps us immensely. Follow us on Twitter and hit the notification bell on YouTube so that you can see all our show announcements as well as on our clip channel on YouTube. And remember, winning is fun and losing sucks.
Let's stop losing.